determine the elongation of that part of that fiber after displacement. It's pretty straightforward because you can the displacement of these two nodes can be calculated like it uses like x1, x3, x2, x4 because each node the directions you can divide it into like the horizontal and vertical displacement. So each node has two axes because yeah it moves in two directions, and I think the others like calculations are pretty straightforward, and you get down to after that. Here the thing is just the Taylor expansion, and this whole t-square thing is basically means the rest of the terms are c times t squared, so it's a constant times t squared, which just don't care about it. And after that, you get the elongation formula. So here, it's a approximate value because it assumes that these two values are a lot smaller than L, so this thing is basically 0, so they got rid of it. And here it is. This formula is coming from the, I think, the Hooke's law, because whenever you have a stick, you apply a force at two ends. The restoring force is basically at the opposite direction. So this is what it's trying to do. This is the restoring force. All those things like EA and L should be a constant, so you don't really have to care about it. And it should be given to you. And this E is the elongation thing we just did. So like, the more you stretch it, the stronger the force is. It's like spring. And here it's just trying to say that no matter what direction the force is, the restoring force is always going to compensate for that force and make the total force 0 on that object.
Take 2 more minutes.
And here is trying to give an example of a change. Pretty straightforward. The most interesting part of this assignment, I think, is building this matrix. And this matrix coming from this thing. So each row is basically information about each of this, like E1, E2, E7, all the way to E7. Those are like elongation, and X are displacements. So it basically means, like for this graph, there are 3 nodes, like 1, 2, and 3. And each of those nodes can be moved in 2 directions. So you have 6 axes. Like, so it's like X1, X2, all the way to X6. And there are 7 edges. So like there are 7 edges and 6 columns. And all the things are just trying to say the displacement of this edge is caused by those 2 factors. Because you can see how are those edges connected. And for example, E1 basically is, X2 is the horizontal movement of the 1, because all those things are, this node is not movable, so, and it doesn't go up. So when you push this thing to the side, it goes to the E1 goes to the side. That's pretty straightforward. And so if it's influenced by X2, you put a 1 here, like to say that and after that, the entire thing here, yeah, just do the same thing for the British. It's a bit more complicated, but it's the same thing. Just analyze how each fiber is moved. Yeah. And do the graph.
Thanks. All right, so before we go any further, how clear are we? Close your eyes and raise And 5 is you can leave and do it right now. How to construct the adjacency matrix using the elongation equations we have. So eyes closed. So 1, really confused, raise your hand. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, thanks. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the physics of it because all you really need is the ultimate elongation equation. So we're going to focus primarily on automating the construction of the adjacency matrix and then look at the displacements and how to update your coordinate system after that. So one of the things I think is tricky in this project is kind of mining the notes and condensing them into the 3 tasks you really have to do in this, because there's a lot of extra information in there, a lot of physics that motivates it that you don't need. So this all condenses into one function, bridge.m, and it does 3 major things. Who can tell me what those are in general? Or at least one of them. What's the first thing it needs to do? Yeah, build the adjacency matrix for the existing bridge. Emily, do you know what's next?
Build the bridge itself.
But we do that. Yeah, okay, there we go, exactly. So through the coordinate system, right? So that builds the bridge. So adjacency matrix, then coordinate system, then what's the third thing?
Build the deformed bridge.
Exactly, build the deformed bridge. So find the displacements of each node based on the coordinate system of the bridge you just built. So adjacency matrix, undeformed bridge, deformed bridge, go. And that's all in one function. And that's it. So I'm not going to review the adjacency matrix too much because we've done this, and Ping Hao just did it for us, and most everybody is relatively confident on this at least. But each node, 2 degrees of freedom. And the main trip up here is that when you're thinking about displacements of these fibers, right? But you're thinking about it in terms of the nodes. And so when you consider what's happening to the fibers, you consider what's happening at each of the respective endpoints. And that varies based on whether or not your endpoint is connected to a surface that can't move, like here, or whether or not it's free or connected to another node. So we consider the fibers in terms of what's happening at their endpoints. Calculating elongation, review the physics in the notes if you want it. If you don't, very simple. End minus beginning in the vertical direction and end minus beginning in the horizontal direction. So x3 and x1 aren't necessarily your node numbers, they're just head to tail, right, in any case. So x3 would be tail in the horizontal direction, and x1 would be the movement of the head. So for this guy, for example, what would E1 be? I know it's up there, but where did it come from? Elongation of fiber 1 is tail minus head in the horizontal direction. So here's our tail, our head's connected. It can't move there, and so the only component we have is this x1. So x1 minus nothing, cosine of theta. And then plus our x4 is our tail in the vertical direction, which is x2, and we have no movement of the head in the vertical direction because it's connected, right? So x4 sine theta. What's theta? 90, Rachel says. Why is theta 90? What does that mean?
It's the right angle.
It makes, yeah, it's the theta is generally, what is theta in general? Yeah, from the right horizontal axis to the fiber. So the angle the fiber you're considering makes with the horizontal axis. So in this case we have 90, so cosine of 90 is 0. So the first term goes away, and then we're just left with x2 sine 90. All right? So it's pretty easy. The only issue is consistency in which direction you're subtracting these guys, head to tail or tail to head. And it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent between fibers. And what I mean by head to tail or tail to head is, say you had fiber 6 here, for example, and you're saying, well, which guy am I subtracting from what when I'm considering the horizontal and vertical motion? Do I do x3 minus x5 for the first term, or do I do x5 minus x3? It doesn't matter so long as you keep the same convention through all of your nodes, and as long as you don't mix up, vertical. Vertical, you need to use the same tail as you used for horizontal. And when we just plug it into the elongation equation, and you don't really need any of the motivating physics to get there, you just need this guy. If you're hungry for it and want to go back and look at it, that's great, but you don't need it for this. All right, so as further example, again, in the interest of time, won't dwell too long on this, the short trailer example that's in the notes, you have all the elongations for, so if you still have questions, you can look at how those are found. But let's look at one that's a little, okay, let's look at E2, and then we're going to work on some on our own for this project. So E2, we know the elongation equation is up here, so what's our first term? Before it's simplified. Up there on the right, I've given you the simplified answer. So where did that come from? Rachel?
X3 minus X1, like, literally.
Well, does fiber 2 connect to
X3,
X1?
sorry. Okay, X3.
What do we do if it's connected? It doesn't move, right? And so you don't have to find a placeholder to go there. You're just looking at the amount of motion in the horizontal direction. So if it can't move here, the only amount of motion in the horizontal direction is going to be what this degree of freedom up top can do. You don't have to put a placeholder there. The difference just gives you the amount of motion, relative to this first node. So that's the only reason you have to consider it at all. So don't worry about it. X3 cosine theta, then what? Plus X4 sine theta. And why don't we have an X2? Why don't we have X4 minus something?
The head doesn't move.
Hmm?
The head doesn't move.
The head doesn't move, exactly. Sorry, we're cramped. So what's theta in this case? 45, okay? Pi over 4. What's cosine and sine of pi over 4 are both? Speak up.
1 over root 2.
1 over root 2. So, and that's E2. And then it's easy to see how it's rearranged into the form we have up there. So that's the same process that happens across the board. If it's connected, don't worry about a placeholder, it's just 0. If it's not connected, maintain your head to tail or tail to head convention, and it's pretty simple. Then the S's here are just placeholders for 1 over root 2, because it'd be easier to automate in code as opposed to typing 1 over root 2 every time. I know Ping Hao reviewed this, but just right before we move on, the structure of the adjacency matrix. I know everybody here has seen matrix vector multiplication and that kind of thing, right? Outside of this class? Yeah? So the reason we're doing this, and I think it's helpful to see before we solve for the elongations, we know, as Ping Hao said, that every row corresponds to one of these equations. All right? So it's basically just this block, and each of the elongation equations correspond to rows. Each of the columns are your degrees of freedom, so 2 times the number of nodes, because each node can move in the horizontal or vertical directions. And then the entries are the coefficients of those degrees of freedom in your elongation equations. So that makes sense, but why are we doing that? We want to be able to write this as a matrix vector system of equations so you can solve easily for your elongations using backslash, which we'll look at in a bit. But look at what we get if we multiply these back out. X, what are these X values right here? Displacements. Do we know what those are? No, because the goal of the project, right, is to find out how much it's displaced when you put a car on there, and then update the coordinate system accordingly. So if these are all these are all variables, we don't know what they are. We know what the elongations are, and we know this matrix because we just built it. And so look what we get if we multiply this back out. If you multiply the A matrix times this vector of unknown displacement, you're going to end up with, by construction, your original this many, 7 number, or how many fibers there are, number of elongation equations. So it's just a way to write the system of equations in a way that MATLAB can solve really easily, for all of these x values, because we're going to need those displacement values to update your coordinate system. Okay, so when you're tackling these, I think the best thing to do is write it out on a piece of paper. People try and just sit there, and code it pretty much blindly and recognize patterns, because when you make these arbitrary, when you accommodate any number of stages, you have to automate the construction of the adjacency matrix, as you know. So no hard coding the adjacency matrix. And I think the best way to automate it is to draw it out, write down the elongation equations, to a reasonable extent, and look for patterns, because you're not going to hard code, every fiber. For fiber 2, put this entry in row 2 of the adjacency matrix, etc., right? You're going to have to say, for this class of fibers, do this. And so the way to recognize those classes, I think, is to draw it out. So take one of these guys, please, for me. Draw your bridge, label all your degrees of freedom, and I want you to write down the elongation equations for the first 2 stages. I'll write the, yeah.
Whenever it says stage, does that mean it's like section on the bottom?
Yeah. So even this first guy right here is a stage. It's a unit of 1 on the horizontal axis along the bottom. And because it's not up there, I'll put up the elongation in general. And you need the bridge drawn on your paper, at least to a reasonable extent, because I'm going to put the PowerPoint up in a second, so unless you can memorize it. Yeah. 45, we're assuming. Did you talk about, was that discussed in class earlier this week?
I just said all the, in the last set, all of them were.
Yeah. Huh?
Last set.
Okay, then there you go. But Sorry, guys. How are we doing? Take one more minute. Have you written down more than 4 elongations yet? Yes and no's. Okay. I'm going to stop you at 10:30, so 1 minute. I can still kind of see it. Great. Okay. So who can give me E1? Somebody's written down E1. Just X1. Where did that come from? Okay.
Where the angle will be 0, so you know that you have no y term inside of 0, 0.
Okay.
And then you only have 1 in the function.
Right, because it's hooked here. All right. What about E2? Somebody different. Everybody's going to need to give me one, so get your one done now and it's easier. Okay, let's do it in this form. Okay, well, yeah, we can use 1 over root 2 plus the same of x4. Okay. Did anybody get something different? Nice.
Yeah, I had that, but then minus x2 over root 2.
Here? Okay, so where did that term come from? Now we're looking at fiber 2.
At the end of fiber 2, x4
So x3 horizontal, x4 vertical. Yeah.
the x2 from before.
Okay.
Lower node.
Well, where is 2 connected to? Where's the head of 2? Can the head of 2 move at all? No. So when we're considering motion in the vertical direction,
Oh, so, okay.
yeah, we only care, don't worry about any of the other fibers. Isolate the fiber you're looking at. This guy, the head is locked there, so we only look at X3 and X4. Make sense? So we can kill that term. Everybody else okay on E2? Yeah, Jennifer?
How do we know which ones, are we just randomly assigning X1 and X2 each?
Okay, so that's your labeling convention. So that's why it's really important to draw it all out and label them all. But you start at the end of fiber 1, right? And then your odds, if you follow the convention in the notes and the one that works pretty well, your horizontal degrees of freedom are going to be your odd numbers, and then your evens are going to be your verticals, right? So you start at the end of fiber 1 and you just worked up. Okay? Yeah.
Does this code our adjacency?
Well, we're about to see how to do it.
Okay.
But you're going to have to code it for any arbitrary structure, okay? So we need to write these out first. E3. So fiber 3 has a head and a tail that can move. Okay. Times cosine of what? Is that 4 and 2? Okay, so we're looking at this guy. Horizontal at the tail is X3. Horizontal at the head is X1. So yeah. Okay, times what? Which is? What about vertical? X4 minus X2, okay, times all right, we're not going to do all of these up here, but does everybody see the process? So you could theoretically sit and write them down on your own? Yes or no answer? Yes, okay. So what you need to recognize when you code it, since we've got these three, the first and last stages, you're going to hard code. Okay, so the first 2 rows of your adjacency matrix and the last 2 rows of your adjacency matrix, you're just going to tell MATLAB what goes in there. That's because they're fixed to the edge of the, to the base of the bridge, and they can't move, and so you can't automate them. So just hard code the first and last stages. And then everything in the middle is easy to automate once you recognize something about the patterns of the elongations. So there's E3. We're going to jump now over to E8. Did anybody write down E8? No. Okay, well, let's do it now. So X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, X6, and that's X7. You should have this labeled on your paper to compensate for how messy it is up here. So what's E8? Head minus, or tail minus head in the horizontal direction gives us what? I know it's messy here. You should have it labeled though on your paper. Uh-huh. Yeah. X7 minus X5 cosine of, same as before, plus, what do we have going on in the vertical direction? Yep. So that was E8. What can you tell me about E of any fiber that looks like that, that's vertical? Yeah, it's going to have the exact same form, and the only thing that's going to change is these indices, okay? And so we know the coefficients for these guys. So cosine of pi over 2 is, do we know our trig? Cosine of 90. Sine of 90. So we have a coefficient of 1 in front of x4 and negative 1 in front of x2. So what about this guy? Come on. Exactly. So that means in rows 3 and 8 of our adjacency matrix, so row 3 and row 8, what are they going to look like? Up. Here to here. For x, yeah, for E3. We have a 1 in column
4.
and,
And the 1 column 6.
okay? What about for E8?
1 in column 8, and then 1 in column 6.
So you have this repeating block of 1 and negative 1 that are just separated by 2. And each time you encounter a vertical column, the onset of that block shifts by how many? 2 plus what is 6? 4. So if we want to guess, the next time we get up there, what was that difference? 5. Okay, and why is that? We go back to the way our bridge is set up. There's 5 fibers between 3 and 8. You're going to count 5 just because the way you're making an X with each stage. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's going to be the exact same thing to get to the next side, right? 8 plus 5 gives you the next vertical fiber, which is 13. So if we're going to use this pattern to fill in row 13 without writing out the elongation, what would row 13 be? You would have a negative 1 and a 1. Where? Negative 1 in x10. And what else? So this block has again shifted by 4. And then we've gone down by 5. And we can check ourselves if you have 13 labeled on your paper. x5, x6, x7, x8, x9, x10, x11, x12. And we know that the horizontal motion is going to be annihilated by our cosine of 90, which is 0, so we're only considering vertical 10 and 12, going to give us the exact same thing we saw before. So what we did is we recognized that vertical fibers are a class of their own. And they're always going to have the same coefficients. It's just that the degrees of freedom are going to shift as you move across the bridge. And then your row is going to shift as you move across fibers. There are different shifting patterns for rows and for degrees of freedom like we saw. This guy moved over by 4, right? And then we jumped 5 fibers because you're making an X. And so when you're coding something like that, any ideas for what we could do? We have an arbitrary, you're giving the number of stages, all right, and you've hard-coded, you've initialized A, you've initialized your big matrix. How have we done that? How many rows does it have? In general. The number of fibers. So you know your fiber number, and how many columns does it have? Your node number times 2. Exactly. So you've initialized it, you've written down your elongations for your first and last stages, and you've filled in those rows accordingly. And then, to accommodate all of the middle cases, how can we do that using the pattern we just recognized? Just in general. brute force way. There are very elegant and brief ways to do this, but you don't have to find them unless you want to. Well, we saw that that vertical fibers follow that pattern. So let's say we wanted to fill in, if we've initialized this, it's all zeros, right? So let's say we want to first fill in all of our vertical fibers. How could we extract the vertical fibers, the indices of the vertical fibers, so we know what rows to go to? Next.
Follow that pattern.
Yeah, you write it down first and you recognize the index pattern, and you just set up a particular type of statement, which we can talk about. But here we saw that all of those indices, you start at 1, and then how did you get to the next index of the next vertical fiber? In this case, we went from 3 to 8 to 13. You add 5. Okay, so that accommodates this X structure. It's specific to this structure of the bridge, but it's arbitrary to the number of stages the bridge has, because this could go on infinitely long with infinitely many stages, but as long as you keep adding 5, you're going to get to the index of another vertical fiber. Does that make sense? So every 5th row is going to need to have a -1 and a 1. Now, where do you start that -1? Every time you jump 5, you move over by how many? 4. Okay. So you could do the exact same thing for horizontal fibers. Do the exact same thing for diagonal fibers in the rightward direction, diagonal fibers in the leftward direction. You've got upper and lower horizontal fibers. So how many different classes of fibers are you going to have?
4.
Yeah. So it's pretty, I think making this arbitrary is doable, because you can just divide it into those 4 classes. And for each of those 4 classes, as you move along, insert the appropriate rows into that row of the adjacency matrix. And you're going to find out what to insert into that row of the adjacency matrix by writing out elongation equations for at least, I think, 2 stages is helpful. Okay. Are we okay on this? We need to move on. What's the next thing we have to do? Undeformed coordinate matrices. And those are pretty simple, once again, if you have your bridge drawn out. Because our coordinate system is very intuitive, all right? If you move over in the x direction, each fiber has a length of 1, right? So we know we've moved over 1. So the next thing you'll need to do on your drawing of the bridge is label the coordinates of all the nodes, okay? So it's only a single story bridge, so it's only going to go up to a potential height of 1. So not very difficult. Then you have to, once again, you need to automate it, okay? And when you automate it, you're going to create 2 matrices, 2 column matrices for these coordinates. You can call them x core and y core. And in I'm going to leave that up there. In x core and y core, you need a row for each fiber. Okay? So, actually, you should have that now. So, for example, x core, you got 2 columns corresponding to starting and ending coordinates, x coordinates, and then a row for fiber 1, for fiber 2, fiber 3, and so on. And y core is going to be the exact same thing, but starting and ending y coordinates. So what would the first row of x core be in this case? Head and tail both have starting coordinate, or both have coordinate 0. So fiber 1 is this guy. Y core would be what? Okay, what about fiber 3? What's x core there? 1, 1. Okay. What's y core for fiber 3? 0, 1. Okay. So to automate this, once you figure out how to divide that bridge into classes and to create a loop structure that accommodates moving across those classes moving arbitrarily far along the bridge, you can use that same automation scheme of dividing into classes to construct, or I claim you can, to construct your coordinate matrices. Okay, because it's gonna be different additions, but your division into your, this is a vertical fiber. We know all vertical fibers are gonna start at this place, end at this place. Then every time you move over a stage, what's gonna happen to the starting x coordinate of a vertical fiber? So this time the starting coordinate of vertical fiber 3 was 1 on the x-axis. When we move over to vertical fiber 8, so we increase the index of our fiber by 5, move 5 down x-core, what happens to the starting x-coordinate of our fiber? Yeah, it's only incremented by 1 because each horizontal fiber only has length 1. So each time you move up 5 in the index of your fiber, your x-coordinate only changes by 1. So you can go through this matrix and you can move down this matrix in the exact same way we moved down the other one by dividing it into those classes, and recognize that the next time you hop to a new stage, you're probably only going to add 1 to any of your indices if you add anything at all. Okay, the horizontal guys are never going to move up. So then the last thing you need to do is update this coordinate system. So you've got the bridge, you've looked at it using line, and there's a quiz question on how to use line to look at a bridge, and you need to spy it using the spy function as well. Did you guys talk about spy on Wednesday? Yeah? What does spy do? You didn't get it? Okay, so to spy a matrix, that just gives you can see it in the notes. Spying a matrix gives you a plot of all the non-zeros, okay? And it's a very, very simple command in MATLAB. It would just be spy in parentheses A. So you need to spy the matrix, your adjacency matrix, after you create it. And then once you create the x-core and y-core matrices, we just talked about it, you need to use line, okay? Well, you'll ultimately use line to plot them. Most people got the line question on the quiz right. So how do we use line to look at this bridge? Yeah, x-core, y-core. Do we have to do anything fancy with x-core and y-core? Go back and look at your quiz. I think there's a transpose in there. Okay, but that shouldn't be too difficult to figure out. And I know the moving trailer code, which you have access to, uses line as well. Okay, so updating the coordinates and then we're done. So you have your existing x-core and y-core, then you need to deform the bridge, and then how do we get from the existing coordinates to the new coordinates once you deform a bridge? The deformations we talked about are in this vector we're solving for. Remember, each of these guys is the amount of motion in a particular direction. So we're solving for these deformations, and we know how much x1 moved, how much node 1 moved in the horizontal direction. So how would we update our existing coordinate system to reflect those changes?
You would update x-core and y-core.
Yeah, you would update x-core and y-core. How?
You would add the elongation that we calculated for each explanation.
Exactly. So you add your displacement. If we know that x1 moved, 4 to the right, then we need to say that the first coordinate of that node is going to move over 4 to the right, because that's how much the node is displaced when you apply the force. So conceptually, it's not difficult to implement it. You're given the equations in your notes, but you need to solve for these displacements, all right? And to solve for the displacements, you have to solve this equation. ATKA is your mother stiffness matrix as referenced. But K is just, and you can, this is a little bit of a black box in this project, but if you just follow these equations and solve them, then you'll be able to do it, okay? If you want to go through the physics, then you can do that in the notes. But you can construct this matrix. You have A transpose because you have A, and then what's K? It's up here. It's a diagonal matrix containing the stiffnesses of all your fibers. This is just following from Hooke's law. Okay, and what's the stiffness of a fiber? EA over L, which is also given. EA is an input to your code, and L of all your fibers is given as well. And so big K, you're going to need to build, but it's very simple. You know the length, you need to calculate the length of each fiber. So the length of the horizontal and vertical fibers is 1. You can use some trig to find the length of diagonal fibers. Then you can create a vector K. This chalk is terrible. Create a column vector K where each entry in your column vector corresponds to the stiffness of that fiber. Okay, so K1, the first entry in the column vector K would be the stiffness of fiber 1. What's the stiffness of fiber 1? Using this guy. EA over L1, length of fiber 1, which is 1. What's the stiffness of fiber 2? Yeah, EA over the length of fiber 2. Beware of the lengths of your diagonal fibers. Okay, so once you have that K, you can set it up in a for loop to create a diagonal matrix, your big K, that's all zeros with little k on the diagonal. One sec. You can use easy MATLAB command diag K. D-I-A-G, little k, which is your vector, and that'll put that vector along the diagonal of a zero matrix. Yeah?
Is that L like the deformed length or the original?
It's the original length.
They all have the same system?
Well, the horizontal and vertical fibers both have length 1. Do the diagonal fibers have different lengths, or are they all 1? The diagonal fibers have different lengths. So use some trig and solve for the lengths of the diagonal fibers. Yep. Yep. I mean, use a for loop to create your K vector. You're not going to want to write out EA over L, whatever, however many times. But yeah, you hard code this. All right, and then to solve for X, the last thing you need is F. Okay, and F is the force vector you get from putting cars on these subsequent nodes. And you need to put there are 4 different car scenarios you need to accommodate. If you have a car on the first node, and then first and second node, first, second, third node, first, second, third, and fourth node. Very last thing, for F, if you had a car there, what information do you have about the cars in the nodes? This whole process is outlined I think pretty well. You put negative W in the location of that node. Okay? Did you guys, you should have gone over this on Wednesday. Did you? I'm getting a lot of blank stares. What does that mean? Did you not go on Wednesday? We didn't go on Wednesday, or they didn't go over it if you did go on Wednesday. This should not be new stuff. Well, which is it? Who went on Wednesday? Did you go over this? You didn't remember solving?
I was lost for half the class, so
Okay. Well, do you guys have class after this? Okay, well, if you need to go, you can go. Otherwise, you can stay and we can talk about it. Okay, so are you guys all staying? Briefly?
Yeah.
All right, so you've got S, ATKA, X, that's doable. And then F is a force vector, all right? And you're telling via that force vector, MATLAB, on what node you apply a downward force when a car is parked on it, okay? So if a car is parked on node 1, then what's our force going to be? We have all that info. Hold on, where is that? Yeah. It's taken into account already. I don't know where that is. It should be in here.
You're down at the very bottom. You're looking at the rest before with the grading scale.
Really? There. I don't know, guys. I'll tell you. All right, so the W for the car, which is given, takes gravity into account. And so you just put, but you do have to consider the directionality, okay? Because it would be displaced in a downward direction, then you need to use negative W. All right? And so if you have a car parked on node 1, and node 1 has vertical degree of freedom x2, and you're applying a load there, then your entry in your force vector is going to be negative W, because you would be downward displacing that node. And then your degree of freedom x2 is with respect to vertical motion in the positive direction. Does that make sense? And so your force would be negative W in the x2 slot. So if you had a car parked on node 2 and node 3, then you'll need to look at the index of the vertical degree of freedom on the next node. And I think they jump by 5 each time. I don't remember how much they jump by, but however much they jump by, then that next guy is also going to need to have a negative W in that slot.
What are the dimensions of our force vector?
1 by the degrees of freedom. So when you're solving this matrix vector problem, X and F, because we're going to use backslash, which we'll talk about in 1 second, X and F need to have the same dimensions. And if we remember X from up here, X is a 1 by the number of degrees of freedom column vector, or a number of degrees of freedom column vector by 1, whatever. And so F is going to be the same. So in the X2 slot, if there were a car parked right there, then you're going to have a negative W in the X2 slot and zeros everywhere else because there's no force applied there. Okay, and if you had a car parked there and there, X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, X6, I guess the vertical degree of motion there is X6. So then you'd have a negative W also in the X6 slot. Does that make sense? And all the rest zeros?
Our F is just a bunch of zeros and 4 negative W's.
Well, subsequently. First you put a car on only the first node. Then you put a car on the first node and the second node. Then you put a car on the first, second, and third nodes, right? It's not that the car moves. I always get that mixed up, but we should clarify.
So if you put a car on node 1, you're just going to have negative W in the x2 column.
And what everywhere else?
So zeros.
Zeros, exactly.
And then when you add another car, you keep that 1.
You keep the first guy. I'm gonna clarify for us that you just add another car and your car isn't moving. W, there we go. W is the weight of a vehicle on the bridge. Cars parked at nodes 1 and 3. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the cars do multiply. You get more cars as you go on. They don't move. All right, so that's this guy, that's F, all right? And you need to do it 4 times, and so you can set up what kind of loop to make all those different F vectors. A for loop, all right? And you remember that picture of the bridge going down, right? So deforming subsequently, you have the initial plot of your undeformed coordinates. We can talk about the deformed coordinates in 1 second, but within that for loop, you'll need to use line to add to that plot of that bridge every time before you go back and create a new force vector. Makes sense? Because the new force vectors represent, now we have the scenario where you have a car parked at 1 and 3, right? And then you have the scenario where you have a car parked at 1, 3, and 5. And each time you go through that for loop, you need to replot it and accommodate those different scenarios. Yeah?
This is the for loop for creating our force vector.
Correct. Yeah, because the force vector represents what happens when you have more cars moving along. Okay. So we've got our for loop set up. We've solved for X. Now you have, and this is the last bit. So now you have X, and what form is X going to be in?
Column vector, which is 1 by column.
Yeah, big thing. So however many degrees of freedom you have, which is your number of nodes times 2. And then, all right, so if it's in that form, then it makes it a bit tricky because our X core and our Y core, remember they have 1 row for each fiber and then 2 columns. But that's separated by X and Y, right? Our existing coordinate system is contained in X core and Y core, separated via X and Y, so line can plot them conveniently. That's what you have to give the line function. So this information about the displacements that we need to use to update X core and Y core is mixed up, right? Because you have both X and Y components in here. You have the evens and the odds. So that's the displacement in the horizontal, vertical, and your coordinates are only, they're separate. So how can we get out the relevant information? You're going to need to extract it, right? So if you want to update your X core, then you're going to need to access the odd components of this guy. To update your Y core, you need to access the even components of this guy. You can either leave it in this long form and not separate it into two different vectors, and then just every time you want to move down one row in X core and update the coordinates for a different fiber, you can say, well, what's the corresponding row of this long guy? How many rows of this are there?
2 times the number of nodes.
Right, which is the same as the number of fibers, the number of elongations, right? Because it has to stack up against this A matrix in order for the matrix vector multiplication to work. And we know the A matrix has number of fibers, number of rows, right? So each time you're trying to update the coordinate system of a fiber, you're going to pull out the corresponding, the relevant guys in here. How many? There could only be 4 possible relevant guys, right? Because there's only 4 degrees of freedom. So the maximum number of guys you're going to need to access could ever only be 4. As you move down it, how are you going to move down each time when you look at a new fiber? So fiber 1, the only possible elements here that could be relevant are X1 through X4, right? Fiber 2, what are the only possible guys that could be relevant? Do you have fiber 2 drawn? Fiber 2 is this guy. So that was X1, X2, X3, X4. Yeah. We'll go, once again, you need to hard code the first and last stages as the same, right? But each time, if there's only 4 that could be relevant, you can consider it in blocks of 4 as you go down. There are tons of different ways to automate this, okay? And the best way and that's your part of the project to figure out, is how to accommodate these arbitrary sizes of vectors and create an indexing system that allows you to move from one to the other and extract the relevant information corresponding to which fiber you're trying to update. And just code those patterns. And you can code patterns simply, or you can do it, really, really brute force and just consider each class, as long as those classes will extend along an arbitrary length of bridge. So however you decide to figure out how to extract the relevant indices from this X vector of displacements, like we said a bit ago, all you need to do is add that to the existing X core and Y core. Beware of indices, add the right displacement to the right row. That's the biggest issue with people in this project, is ending up with plots of bridges that are wonky because the displacements weren't added to the coordinate systems in the correct way. Okay, but that's yours to figure out. And that's pretty much it. And since that's embedded in a for loop, the next time you move cars over and cycle over with a different force and solve for different x, then you're going to have different displacements, different new coordinates, and then a different plot. Last thing, how to solve for x given that system. That's the difference between this week and next week. This week we use backslash. Did you guys go over that if you went Wednesday? So what is backslash, GMC?
Backslash solves for x.
Yeah. It's MATLAB's solver, uses LU decomposition to solve for a whole vector of answers to a system of equations. So it's easier than writing your own solver, which is what you're going to have to do next week. But so x, you get s backslash f. And what was s again?
It's like A transpose times K times A.
Exactly. And you got a, you made k by diagonalizing that vector, right? And we made the k vector by taking EA, which is given over L, where L is 1 and 1 for horizontal and vertical fibers, and then something obtained by trig for the diagonals. Okay? And that's in a for loop, so you're only tough parts are just automating the pattern construction for recognizing different classes. But once you get the hang of it, it's totally doable. So are we good? Pretty good? Okay, guys. Sorry it went over. I wonder, is there any way that this could be like accessible to them by this weekend